Hey folks, welcome to the January 2022 video. I believe this is season 2, episode 19. This one is going to be kind of continuation about GoPros in cinematic footage versus stabilized footage. This is actually based on a lot of experimentation I've been doing, and it's also based on a lot of questions that I had and that I see people asking in the GoPro Reddit subreddit. So if you're from the GoPro subreddit and you see this link, me linking, hopefully this can help you. So these GoPros are pretty cool devices. They're a lot of fun. They're a less than $500 camera, but they're an action camera, not a cinematic camera. But they can do cinematic footage, and you're gonna see here in a second. When I first got this, I was saying, oh, cinematic footage, you can do this 24 frames per second. And then I asked, like, what is cinematic footage? And I used their settings. Here's kind of the gist that I got out of what cinematic footage is. Cinematic footage is 24 frames per second, 1/48th of a shutter speed. If you take 24, multiply it by 2, you get 48, 1/48. It's called the 180 rule. What this allows is motion blur. And as you see, like right now, as I'm moving my hand, because this camera is shooting at 24 frames per second and all that, it's just about motion blur. It's not about resolution. You could do it at 1080, 2K, 4K, 5K, none of that matters. It's not about the white balance. It's not about anything else other than the frame rate and the shutter speed. That's it. Everything else you do on top of that is up to you. The first thing you're going to notice when you do that and you take your GoPro camera out and experiment is that it's just overblown. You can't see anything, and I'll show some footage right now of the example. It's so bright because in 1/48th of a second there's light hitting the camera, which is too much, because outside out in the sun it would normally be quite a bit higher than that. It might be 1/300th or whatever multiple of 24, but it'd be a much higher. So a little company called Polar Pro makes these really nice ND filters, and what these ND filters allow you to do is you snap it on there and it reduces the amount of light that can come into the camera sensor by some fixed amount. These are ND8, 16, and 32. So you have 3 jumps, 3 quantum jumps. It's not like an iris where you can kind of ease it to where you want. And that kicks down the darkness, which allows your footage to look like actually exposed, because at 24 frames per second, 1/48th. So why do this? Like, why do people do this? Well, it creates this natural motion blur, like you see my hand, that you're just accustomed to seeing. What I'm going to do right now is I'm going to actually show some various footage of a windmill and then a couple other things. And what you'll see here is you're going to see examples of 24 frames per second, the slow shutter speed of 1/48th, and then I turn the iris all the way down to make it exposed, and then another one where a very high shutter speed where it looks quick. Now what you saw was that the windmill, as it was turning, on one it looked flowing like how you would see in real life, and the other it looked kind of choppy. It looked like it was just in 6 or 8 different pieces, and it was like flickering. That doesn't look natural. It doesn't look good. So like the whole idea of the cinematic footage is you want the flowy motion blur. Now understand, with cinematic footage it creates motion blur. That's the goal. So on the other end of the spectrum, we have something called Hypersmooth. And this is where I got in trouble, and this is where I think other people are getting in trouble as well. They think, oh, this camera is so cool because it smooths out the footage. So I'll throw my ND filter on there and I'll go set it on to cinematic mode. Now I've got a cinematic, smoothing, and the video looks like hell. When I first started doing that, I noticed it was just really bad. It was almost worse than nothing. If I would have just put it in full auto, it would have been way better. What you have to understand is what Hypersmooth is. Hypersmooth is electronic stabilization. So as 1 second goes by, you get 24 frames. Each frame has a shutter speed, in this case 1/48th of a second. Now the whole point of that cinematic was to get motion blur, but as you're moving around doing action camera stuff, these things move. You're getting a whole lot of blur. Well, the way the electronic stabilizations, it takes frame 1 in frame 2 and kind of cuts the edges off and stitches one over the other. Now when they're blurry because the camera's moving, you're gonna find that it doesn't work at all. Even in like shadows. I'm in shadows right now. I intentionally shot this in shadows. I notice a lot of people in the Reddit, they'll say, hey, I think my camera's broken. Like the Hypersmooth just looks so bad because they're taking it out and they're using it and it's in shadows. And what happens is the automatic settings increase the shutter speed to lower and lower and it can't stitch it. That Hypersmooth works exceptionally well at a faster and faster shutter speed because what happens? Well, there's, you know, a brief period of time, there's less movement in the picture because it's a faster shutter speed, and the system can stitch one on the other much, much better. And I'm actually going to show a few examples. This is at 24 frames per second, where some I'm doing a cinematic, where you can see there's going to be bumpy, really bad footage, and then some are going to be 24 frames per second, but the fastest shutter speed I could get on this. And what I did was I just upped the ISO to where it finally looked okay. So for these walking ones, you'll see 3 different ones. Footsteps just make video look really bad. It's hard to smooth them out. And you can see like with the Hypersmooth and the ND filter, it doesn't look very good. It just doesn't. But with the faster shutter speed and I just raise the ISO, I'm still walking here and yet it smooths everything out. Now if you had a gimbal, you know, you would definitely be ahead of the game, but I don't. So you see quite the difference. One is really stable and then one looks really bad. So it's a bit of a compromise with this device. And this is kind of what I've learned about every camera device. Every lens, every camera has compromises, has weak strengths and weaknesses. If you're gonna make cinematic footage, and that's your goal, I mean, do understand that this is not really a cinematic camera. It can just do cinematic settings. You would never really see this in place. And the big thing is, cinematic cameras are big, bulky, and super expensive, and they don't move really quick, really easy. They don't do this. They're big and they're on stabilization. So if you want to get cinematic footage with your GoPro, and you can actually for your projects, the best way to do it is somehow have the GoPro mounted where it's not wiggling at all. If you have a gimbal, I've never experimented with one, try that. But really, what's really cool about the GoPro is you can mount it in so many little funky places on the magnets and suction cups and so many things where it won't really move around a whole lot. Then you can get pretty good cinematic footage using these Polar Pro filters. Now, that's on one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum, and this is kind of where a lot of people are having issues. If you want to use the Hypersmooth feature, where it does electronic stabilization, you do not want to use the filters because you want as much light hitting that thing as possible. Because you're going to actually do a couple things. One, the Hypersmooth footage I find looks best at 60 frames per second. And then you can slow it down to 24, or you just load it at 60 into your editor in a 24 frame per second timeline. But I find 60 is the way to go. And I also find that you want to, if you can go in there and manually make the shutter speed as fast as you can and get away with, it's going to look better. If you're in a shady place like I am right here, and actually I forgot my SD card on this, and you want to do some sort of smooth footage, you don't want to do cinematic. Experiment with your ISO. And this is kind of like the ISO, if you don't know, the 100 is the best quality but the lowest sensitivity, and as you go up, the quality decreases but the sensitivity to light increases, and you're gonna find there's a Goldilocks zone. What I really like about the GoPro, and what I really hope this video can help you do, is I hope it can help you experiment. Because what I've been doing is thinking, well, if I'm in a shady place, how can I get I want stabilized footage. But if I have a long shutter speed, it's gonna not be stabilized footage. So fix the shutter speed something quick, and then give the ISO a higher maximum. And you're gonna want to experiment what looks good for you. Some people, they won't go above 800, some people 1600. You're gonna wanna go out and take it out into certain places. There was actually some footage that someone uploaded, and they were thinking, I think my camera's broken, because they were following along with someone, and it was probably in the Pacific Northwest. It's how I'm outside, but they're in shade, and it had that kind of distinct look to it. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to give your ISO more room, shutter speed quicker, and that's how you get really good hypersmooth footage. And I'm actually going to show some examples where I did this in 24 frames per second, and I was doing this. I was actually shaking the camera, because I found that the footage looked especially bad when I was walking. Every step I would take, the camera's doing this. But when I did this whole fast shutter speed thing, it looked pretty smooth. I mean, considering the camera's moving, and then when I did it with the full cinematic everything, and you'll see that too, it's almost unwatchable. So that's kind of, understand that the Hypersmooth just doesn't work with the ND filters, because how Hypersmooth works, it needs no motion blur or very little motion blur. And how cinematic footage works is you're trying to generate motion blur. So if you're trying to do opposite things and then meet in the middle, it's best not to do it. If you're going to use cinematic footage with your GoPro, like I said, get it on a mounted, a gimbal, something where it's not moving. And actually the footage looks pretty cool when you do that. And if you want stabilized footage, like you're vlogging or you're doing something, you're gonna want a faster shutter speed and let the ISO compromise. Every camera is always about compromise. There is no perfect in every case. I actually saw like a forum, this was years ago, and someone was saying how they're having issues with their GoPro, and then people were chiming in saying, oh, well, you should get this camera with this setup. And I went and looked all that stuff, and it was like $5,000. And they're offering a $5,000 solution to a $400 problem. You're really not helping. So I kind of hope that helps you. I'm going to show some more examples where you just kind of get like a gist of it, understand what cinematic footage is and how it's different than action footage. These are two completely different things. The GoPro is designed for action. This is what they really designed it for. Cinematic, it's just a really cool feature they can do. So anyway, I hope that helped you. If you like my shirt, this is a Don ONeill shirt. My company, I'm not sponsored by anyone but me. And check us out, dononeill.com. My grandfather was a master watercolor artist, painted all over the world, all over California, Latin America, Europe. If you like cool stuff of like Laguna Beach and stuff, check it out. Check us out on Instagram at Don ONeill Watercolor. If this video helped you, give us a like. It really helps. Follow me on Instagram at Riley ONeill. I guess I will see you next month.
Okay, for a couple examples, you'll see this in the water, how the water on the left looks glass-like and there's not really a lot of flow. And then now it's more fluid. It looks more how your eyeball sees it. And you'll see side by side, one just looks more natural than the other, but if you like the one on the left, here's kind of how to do it. Now for the traffic one, the first one, there's a full cinematic. The second one, there's not. You can definitely tell the cars just look like they're moving in space, but there's no motion. It's kind of a weird feeling. The motion blur just makes them look more natural. Now we have the waterfall, and you can see that with a slower shutter speed, it doesn't look so almost jagged. And it's just different ways how to get something. More people generally like how it looks on the right. Now with these ones, I did a couple more tests. Do understand there's the ND filters are more useful even if you are using Hypersmooth. You just have to watch the shutter speed. I'm using this outside. The best stabilized footage is going to be outside with the lowest ISO, a pretty high frame rate, 60, but it works at 24 and a fast shutter speed. Like this right here, I had an ND8. But also understand that there's other cool things you can do with the ND filters that have nothing to do with cinematic footage or stabilized video like what you see here. I just think these are cool.